On November 15, 1966, two young couples were driving a stretch of back road outside Point Pleasant, West Virginia, when they say something stepped out of the dark and looked at them with eyes that glowed red. They said it was 6, maybe 7 feet tall, gray, man-shaped, but wrong. Wings folded against its back that unfolded into something close to 10 feet across. They said it chased their car, not stumbled after it, chased it. Witnesses estimated their speed near 100 miles an hour, and they said the thing kept pace beside them until it broke off right at the edge of town. That night, they went to the sheriff. The next morning, a local paper ran a headline that would outlive everyone involved in writing it. Couples see man-sized bird, creature, something. Here's what this investigation's actually about. Over the following 13 months, dozens of people in that same small town reported seeing the same winged figure. Then, on December 15, 1967, a bridge in that town collapsed during rush hour, and 46 people died. And after that day, the sightings stopped. This isn't a story about whether a monster's real. It's about why a whole town decided it was, and what really tore that bridge apart while everyone was looking at the sky. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, sits where the Kanawha River meets the Ohio, a small industrial town, the kind of place with one main bridge, one local paper, and everybody's business known by supper time. In November of 1966, that town became the epicenter of one of the strangest sustained sighting waves in American folklore. It didn't start with the couples on Route 62. A few days earlier, on November 12th, grave diggers working near Clendenin reported something large and man-shaped gliding low over the trees. It's a less airtight account than what came days later, but it's there in the record. An early tremor before the main event. Then came November 15th. Roger Scarberry and his wife Linda, along with Steve Millette and his wife Mary, were driving near an abandoned World War II munitions site outside town. Locals called it the TNT area, a stretch of old bunkers and overgrown roads near a decommissioned National Guard armory. That's where they said they saw it. Standing near the armory, or the old power plant beside it, watching them. Roger hit the gas. Linda would later describe the panic of watching something keep pace with a car doing over 100 miles an hour. Not flapping frantically, but gliding, like it barely had to try. Steve and Mary, in the back seat, said the same thing. The eyes were the part that stayed with them. Red, reflective, fixed on the car the whole time. They didn't drive home and go to bed. They drove straight to the Mason County Sheriff's Office and told a deputy what they'd seen. That same night, while it was still fresh enough to shake in their hands. The next day, the Point Pleasant Register ran the story. The headline didn't call it Mothman. That name came later, borrowed by a headline writer riffing on the campy Batman villain of the era. But the article treated the witnesses as credible and gave the creature its first public shape. Within a day, Marcella Bennett came forward with her own account, separate from the Scarberry and Millette sighting, her own night, her own fear. She said the creature rose up from the ground near her car and followed her and her companions back toward a house. 2 different incidents, 2 different nights, but the same shape, the same red eyes, arriving in the record almost back to back. By the end of November, wire services had picked up the story nationally. Point Pleasant, a town most Americans couldn't have found on a map a week earlier, suddenly had a name attached to it that wasn't going away. Not everyone in 1966 believed a monster was loose along the Ohio River, and the skeptical case deserves its place in this story. Not as a footnote added to be fair, but as a genuinely serious counter-theory that many scientists still find convincing. On December 1st, a wire piece ran nationally under the headline, "Monster Bird with Red Eyes May Be Crane." Dr. Robert L. Smith, a wildlife biologist at West Virginia University, became the most cited voice behind that theory. His candidate was the sandhill crane, a genuinely large bird with a wingspan approaching 7 feet and reddish skin around the eyes that, under headlights, in panic, at night, could plausibly read as glowing red. Smith's theory wasn't a dismissal. It was an attempt to explain frightened, sincere witnesses without inventing a cryptid. It's a good theory. It's just not one that explains everything. On December 4th, 5 pilots at Gallipolis Airport in Ohio, just across the river from Point Pleasant, reported their own sighting, in daylight, as trained aviation observers whose entire professional skill set is built around correctly identifying things in the sky. A misidentified bird at night by a frightened civilian is one explanation. 5 experienced pilots in broad daylight agreeing on what they saw is considerably harder to wave away with the same theory. The sightings kept coming through the winter and into 1967. Not constant, not every night, but steady enough that the local paper's correspondent, Mary Heyer, kept a running account in her column. Heyer wasn't chasing a legend. She was doing her job, writing down what people in her town kept telling her they'd seen, treating them with a seriousness many outside journalists wouldn't have bothered with. She became, without setting out to, the person who kept the record of that year in real time, before anyone knew how the story would end. Word reached a New York writer named John Keel, who made repeated trips to Point Pleasant to interview witnesses and corresponded with Heyer between visits. What he would eventually do with it would shape how the entire world remembers what happened here. The Silver Bridge had stood over the Ohio River since 1928, carrying U.S. Route 35 between Point Pleasant and Gallipolis, Ohio. It wasn't built like the suspension bridges most people picture today. It was an eye-bar chain bridge. Its load carried through a chain of long steel links called eye-bars, pinned together end to end like an enormous bicycle chain stretched across a river. It had been engineered for the traffic of its era, a fraction of the weight that would eventually cross it every day. By December 15, 1967, close to 40 years of that weight had passed over the bridge. At around 4:30 in the afternoon, with the bridge loaded bumper to bumper during rush hour, something gave way. Deep inside one eye-bar, engineers would later identify it precisely, a joint on the Ohio sidespan. A flaw smaller than the width of a fingernail had been quietly growing for decades. It wasn't rust you could see. It wasn't a crack anyone could have spotted by looking. It sat hidden inside the eye of the joint itself, growing through a slow combination of stress and corrosion that no visual inspection of that era could have caught without disassembling the joint entirely. That afternoon, it reached its breaking point. The bottom half of the eye-bar's eye fractured first, sudden and brittle. Then the top half tore, pulling its neighbor off the pin that held the chain together. Because the bridge's design ran only 2 eye-bars through each link, no backup, no redundancy. The failure of that one joint meant the failure of everything. The chain came apart. The towers gave, and in seconds, the entire span dropped into the river, cars and all. 46 people died. 44 were eventually recovered and identified. 2 never were. 32 vehicles went into the river with them. Recovery work stretched on for months, divers working the cold water long after the news trucks had gone home. The final engineering report wasn't published until 1971. But what it confirmed was mechanical. A hidden flaw, an old design, a bridge asked to carry far more than it was ever built for. There's no official finding, not from the NTSB, not from any engineer who studied that eye-bar, connecting anything supernatural to why that bridge fell. And yet, some who lived through that day would later say they remembered something near the bridge that afternoon. A shape. A shadow, a creature. Those claims exist, but they weren't part of the contemporaneous reports filed in the hours and days after the collapse. They surfaced later, folded into the story after the fact, Once people were already looking for a reason the sky itself might have been trying to warn them. Here's the part of the story almost everyone gets wrong, because it's the part that makes the best headline. 13 months of sightings, then a tragedy, then silence. It's an almost unbearably clean shape for a story to take, and that's exactly why it became the version everyone remembers. In 1975, John Keel published The Mothman Prophecies. And it was Keel, not the original witnesses, not the sheriff's office, not any engineer, who built the narrative that would define Mothman for the rest of the century. The idea that the creature wasn't just frightening, but meaningful. That it had been trying to warn the town. That its appearance and disappearance were bound to the bridge's fate. Keel wove in other threads too. A man named Woodrow Derenberger, who weeks before the Scarberry sighting had reported meeting a humanoid figure calling itself Indrid Cold on a nearby highway. A completely separate story that Keel folded into his larger paranormal narrative until, in the public imagination, the threads blurred into one. None of that framing. The warning, the mission, the omen, appears in what the Scarberrys and Millettes told the sheriff that first night. What they described was not a guardian. It was something that chased their car at over 100 miles an hour with its eyes locked on them. Frightening, aggressive maybe, not benevolent. Whatever meaning the creature carries now was added afterward by a writer working nearly a decade later and cemented further in 2002 when a film loosely based on Keel's book brought a fictionalized version of the story to audiences who'd never heard of Point Pleasant at all. Here's what the record actually shows. Beginning in November of 1966, dozens of people in and around Point Pleasant reported encounters with a large, gray, man-shaped creature with glowing red eyes and roughly a 10-foot wingspan. The sightings continued for 13 months. Then, on December 15, 1967, the Silver Bridge collapsed during rush hour, killing 46 people. A collapse later explained in full by engineers as a hidden material flaw in a single aging eye-bar, magnified by a design with no redundancy to stop the failure once it began. After that day, the sightings largely stopped. The connection between those two facts is not an engineering finding. It's not a police record. It's a story, authored years later by a writer who arrived after the sightings began and left with a book that turned a frightened town's year of fear into a prophecy. What remains unresolved is the sightings themselves. What dozens of ordinary people, including trained pilots in broad daylight, genuinely believed they saw over those 13 months. A misidentified crane explains some of it. It may not explain all of it. What's certain is that Point Pleasant lost 46 of its own to a bridge that gave way for reasons entirely explainable by steel and time. And that somewhere along the way, the story people chose to keep telling wasn't about the bridge at all. There are a lot more strange corners of this world worth stepping into. Subscribe. We're just getting started.